Am Montag? 9 Uhr? Im Sommer? Ever felt lost with German time prepositions? You're not alone. In this video, I'll show you how to use the German time prepositions like a pro, so you can say when things happen clearly and confidently. Let's go! So, what are temporal prepositions? Temporal prepositions are a special group of words in German that tell us when something happens or how long it lasts. In other words, they help us understand the relationship between an action or event and a point in time, or a period of time. For example, temporal prepositions let you say things like at 3 p.m., since Monday, or for 2 hours. In German, we can divide these prepositions into two main groups. First, we have the point-in-time prepositions, in German, Präpositionen des Zeitpunkts. These answer the question, when exactly? They tell us about a specific moment or starting point, like at 9 o'clock, on Monday, on the 5th of January, in August, or in summer. Then we have the duration prepositions, Präpositionen der Zeitdauer. These answer the question, how long, and tell us about the length of an action or state. For example, for 2 hours, since 2022, or from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. In this video, we're going to focus on the first group, the point-in-time prepositions. So today, we're zeroing in on der Zeitpunkt, the point in time, and how you can use it to talk about when things happen in German. All right, let's take a closer look at the word der Zeitpunkt. In German, der Zeitpunkt means point in time, and its plural form is die Zeitpunkte. So, what is a Zeitpunkt? It's simply the moment when something happens, like at 10 a.m., on Monday, in July, or in summer. Here's an example in English to make it crystal clear. You might ask, when does the class begin? And you'd say, the class starts at 9 a.m. Notice here, we're pinpointing an exact moment. We're not talking about how long the class lasts. We're just talking about the starting point. Another example, when is your birthday? My birthday is on the 5th of May. Here again, we're referring to a specific date, a point in time, not the duration. And one more example. When do we go on vacation? We will go on vacation in August. Same thing here. This is about when, a point in time, not about how long the vacation lasts or when it ends. That's the essence of der Zeitpunkt. It's always about when exactly something happens, not about how long it goes on for. And this is a really important concept when you're starting to learn German, especially at the A1 level. As you've seen in English, when we ask about a point in time, a Zeitpunkt, we use the question word when. In German, it's very similar. To ask about Zeitpunkt, the main question word is wann. And because wann is a W-Frage word, it always comes in the first position. The conjugated verb then takes second position, and the subject moves to the third position, followed by the rest of the sentence. Here are a few examples. Wann beginnt der Unterricht? When does the class begin? Wann hast du Geburtstag? When is your birthday? Wann fahren wir in den Urlaub? When are we going on vacation? But wann is not the only way to ask questions about a point in time. You can also ask, wie viel Uhr beginnt der Kurs? At what time does the course start? Or, an welchen Tag hast du frei? On which day do you have a day off? There are multiple ways to ask questions about Zeitpunkt, and as you move forward in your German learning journey, you'll get to know more of them. For now, just remember, the simplest and most common way to ask about a point in time is with wann. And what about the answers? Just like in English, we use different prepositions, at 9 a.m., on 5th May, or in August. In German, we also have different prepositions for this. Let's start with the first one, In German, the preposition is your go-to word when you want to state an exact clock time, very much like at in English. So whenever you answer a wann question with a precise hour or minute, you'll almost always use For example, wann beginnt der Kurs? When does the course begin? Der Kurs beginnt 9 Uhr. The course begins at 9 a.m. Or simply, 9 Uhr. Here, 9 Uhr pinpoints the exact hour. Another example. Wann fängt der Film an? When does the film start? Der Film fängt 7:45 an. The film starts at 7:15. Or simply 7:45. Here, 7:45 gives the exact time the film starts. And you can use for any precise time. Whole hours, half hours, quarter hours, or even specific minutes. For example, wann hast du deinen Termin? When is your appointment? Ich habe meinen Termin 10:30. I have my appointment at 10:30. Wann fängt das Konzert an? When does the concert start? Das Konzert fängt 20:15 Uhr an. The concert starts at 8:15 p.m. Remember, is an accusative preposition, so whatever follows it is in the accusative case. But when we're talking about clock times, like 9 Uhr, 8:15, or 20:15 Uhr, we typically don't use an article at all. Because there's no article or noun ending to change, you don't really see the accusative case in action. But grammatically, it's still there. So if you want to point to an exact clock time in German, is your best friend. Let's now move to the next preposition, The preposition is used to pin down a time of day, die Tageszeit, day of the week, der Tag, a specific calendar date, das Datum, and for weekends, das Wochenende. Is actually a contraction of an dem, an is the preposition, and dim is the dative article for masculine and neuter nouns. When we're talking about time, an always takes the dative case. You'll see later that an can also be used as a preposition of location, and in those instances, it can govern either the accusative or the dative case, depending on the situation. But when we're talking about a point in time, a Zeitpunkt, an always takes the dative case. So this is why we say when referring to specific moments or days. All right, let's now see how to use in different contexts. Case 1. Talking about the time of day, die Tageszeit. For example, wann gehst du joggen? When do you go jogging? Ich gehe am Morgen joggen. I go jogging in the morning. Or simply am Morgen. Here's the important thing to notice. Morgen is a masculine noun, and since it's following the preposition an, it has to be in the dative case. So the full form is actually Ich gehe an dem Morgen joggen. But in everyday German, an dem is always contracted to am. That's why you'll never hear a German speaker say, Ich gehe an dem Morgen joggen. You will always hear, Ich gehe am Morgen joggen. Let's look at another example. Wann hast du deinen Termin? When do you have your appointment? Ich habe am Vormittag meinen Termin. I have my appointment in the morning. Or, in short, am Vormittag. Same logic applies here. Another one. Wann gehst du ins Fitnessstudio? When do you go to the gym? Ich gehe am Abend ins Fitnessstudio. I go to the gym in the evening. So, you can see how works for different times of the day. All right, we also need to understand an important rule here. When a time of day, like morning, afternoon, or evening, is preceded by an adverb of time, such as heute, today, morgen, tomorrow, or gestern, yesterday, we do not use the preposition In fact, in this context, we don't use any preposition at all. Let's look at an example. Ich gehe heute Abend ins Kino. I'm going to the cinema this evening. Notice that we just say heute Abend and not am heute Abend. This would be incorrect. The same applies to other times of the day combined with adverbs. Morgen früh, tomorrow morning. Gestern Nachmittag, yesterday afternoon. Heute Nacht, tonight. For example, ich komme morgen früh zur Arbeit. I'm coming to work tomorrow morning. Sie fliegt morgen Mittag nach Berlin. She's flying to Berlin tomorrow at noon. And we also need to look at another exception in Tageszeit where we don't use All the other times of the day use like am Morgen, am Vormittag, am Nachmittag, and am Abend. But when we talk about the night, we say in der Nacht. Why? Because Nacht is a feminine noun, die Nacht. And when we talk about a point in time at night, we use the preposition in the dative case, so it becomes in der Nacht. For example, wann gehst du schlafen? When do you go to bed? Ich gehe in der Nacht schlafen. I go to bed at night. Or wann hast du gearbeitet? When did you work? Ich habe in der Nacht gearbeitet. I worked at night. So remember, am Morgen, am Vormittag, am Mittag, am Nachmittag, am Abend, but for night, it's always in der Nacht. Now let's move to case 2, talking about days of the week. Here we also use For example, wann hast du frei? When do you have a day off? Ich habe am Dienstag frei. I have a day off on Tuesday. Same logic applies. The days of the week, like Montag, Dienstag, Mittwoch, are masculine. In the dative case, this becomes an dem Dienstag, which is contracted to am Dienstag. Let's see a couple of more examples. Wir gehen am Freitag ins Kino. We're going to the cinema on Friday. Am Samstag besuche ich meine Familie. I'm visiting my family on Saturday. And you can also combine the day of the week with the time of day to be even more precise. For example, am Sonntagabend gehe ich ins Kino. On Sunday evening, I go to the cinema. This way, you're not only saying which day something happens, but also when exactly on that day it takes place. So you can be very precise. You can say both the day and the time of day when talking about your plans or daily routine. Let's see a couple of more examples. Am Montagmorgen habe ich einen Termin beim Arzt. On Monday morning, I have a doctor's appointment. Am Freitagabend treffe ich meine Freunde. On Friday evening, I'm meeting my friends. Now let's move on to case 3, talking about specific dates. We also use when referring to an exact date. For example, wann hast du Geburtstag? When is your birthday? Ich habe am 5. Mai Geburtstag. My birthday is on the 5th of May. Here, the date, 5. Mai, is a specific point in time, so we use In German, when we talk about dates, we always use ordinal numbers, like fünfte, dritte, erste, and so on. Since the date is following the preposition an, it's in the dative case. So it becomes am 5. Mai. If you're not sure about how to form ordinal numbers, don't worry. We have a separate video where we cover this in detail. The structure here is very simple. Plus ordinal number plus Monat. And you can drop the month if it's already clear from context. Let's see a couple of more examples. Wir fahren am 12. Juni in den Urlaub. We're going on vacation on June 12th. Am 20. Oktober habe ich ein Bewerbungsgespräch. On October 20th, I have a job interview. Let's move on to the next case. Case 4. Is used when we talk about the weekend, das Wochenende. In German, the weekend is treated as a single unit of time, and we use am Wochenende to refer to it. Let's look at a few examples. Am Wochenende besuche ich meine Eltern. On the weekend, I visit my parents. Am Wochenende fahren wir zum See. We're going to the lake on the weekend. Am Wochenende habe ich frei. I have time off on the weekend. All right, now let's move on to the next preposition, im. Im is a contraction of the preposition in and the definite article dem. When used to talk about time, in always takes the dative case. We use im when we are talking about specific months, der Monat, seasons, die Jahreszeit, specific year, das Jahr. Let's start with case 1, talking about specific months. For example, im Juli fahren wir nach Italien. In July, we're going to Italy. Ich mache im August Urlaub. I'm going on vacation in August. Here, you can see how im clearly marks a point in time, referring to a specific month when something happens. Case 2. We also use im when talking about seasons, like summer, winter, spring, or autumn. For example, im Sommer ist das Wetter warm. In summer, the weather is warm. Im Winter fällt oft Schnee. In winter, it often snows. Here, im is used to point to a specific period of the year, a point in time when something happens, or a general fact about that season. So anytime you're referring to a season in German, like im Sommer, im Winter, im Frühling, or im Herbst, you'll use the preposition im. Case 3. We also use im when talking about a specific year. For example, im Jahr 2025 feiere ich meinen Geburtstag in Berlin. In the year 2025, I'll celebrate my birthday in Berlin. But in everyday conversation, it's very common to drop im Jahr and just say the number, especially when the context is already clear. So you'll often hear 2025 fahre ich nach Berlin. In 2025, I'm going to Berlin. This is completely natural when you're speaking. But when you want to be explicitly precise, or when you want to emphasize the year, it's best to stick with im Jahr plus year. Let's see a couple of more examples. Im Jahr 2025 fange ich einen neuen Job an. In the year 2025, I'm starting a new job. 2028 möchte ich ein Haus am Meer kaufen. In 2028, I'd like to buy a house by the sea. Okay, we know that the preposition im is actually a contraction of the preposition in and the definite article dem, which is used for masculine and neuter nouns in the dative case. We used im for months, as months in German are masculine, for example, der Januar. We also used im for seasons, as seasons in German are also masculine. We used them in the phrase im Jahr because the word Jahr in German is neuter, it is das Jahr. So we could frame sentences like im Jahr 2025 feiere ich meinen Geburtstag in Berlin. The preposition in is also used in two other common situations, but in both these situations, it is not followed by the definite article dem, so we cannot use the contraction im. But these situations are also important for us to learn, so let's go through them. In fact, we have already come across one such situation. We know that the Tageszeit Nacht is feminine, die Nacht, and we use the preposition in with Nacht. Since the dative of feminine definite article is der, our expression becomes in der Nacht. Note that while we are using the preposition in, we are not using im. Rather, with Nacht, we use in der Nacht. Let's look at a couple of examples. In der Nacht sind die Straßen ruhig. At night, the streets are quiet. Wir kommen in der Nacht an. We'll arrive in the night. In der Nacht regnet es oft. It often rains at night. Let's deal with the next situation where we use the preposition in. We also use the preposition in to indicate a point of time in the future. For example, when someone asks you, Wann treffen wir uns? When shall we meet? You can reply, Wir treffen uns in einer halben Stunde. We'll meet in half an hour. In such cases, meaning when we're talking about a point in the future or how long it will be until something happens, we use the preposition in, followed by the dative case. Notice that the noun Stunde is feminine, and in this situation we need an indefinite article in the dative case. The indefinite article for feminine nouns in the dative case is einer. So we have, Wir treffen uns in einer halben Stunde. Don't worry if you're not fully comfortable with the dative yet. You'll understand all of this once you study the dative case in depth. Right now, I just want you to be aware of how the preposition in works in this context. Let's look at a couple more examples. Wann fliegst du zurück? When are you flying back? In 2 Tagen. In 2 days. Here, because Tagen is plural, we don't use an indefinite article, so it's just in 2 Tagen, without any article. Wann beginnt dein Kurs? When does your course start? Der Kurs startet in einem Monat. The course starts in 1 month. Here, Monat is masculine, and in the dative case the indefinite article is einem, so it becomes in einem Monat. To sum up, with in plus dative, you have a simple, consistent way to set any event a certain time from now. Perfect for making appointments, talking about departures, or referring to deadlines and more. All right, now let's move on to the next category of prepositions, ones that are related to each other. These are vor, nach, and zwischen. When you want to describe a point in time relative to another event or time, German gives you 3 very handy prepositions: vor for before, nach for after, and zwischen for between. You'll use these whenever you don't, or don't need to, give an exact clock time, but rather mark something in relation to another point. Let's start with the first one, vor, which means before. As a time preposition, vor is always used with the dative case. We use vor when we mean before a reference point. For example, Wann kommst du an? When will you arrive? Ich komme vor dem Essen an. I'll arrive before the meal. Or simply, vor dem Essen. Notice here how we have vor dem because Essen is neuter and in the dative case. We can also use vor with a specific time when the exact point is a bit loose. For example, Wann machst du Yoga? When do you do yoga? Vor 8 Uhr mache ich Yoga. I do yoga before 8 a.m. Here, you're not talking about an exact time every day, but roughly saying before 8 a.m. So vor works perfectly when referring to a point in time you want to mark loosely. In this way, vor lets you set the scene before an event or a specific point in time. Let's now move on to nach, which works very similarly to vor. Nach means after, and when used as a time preposition, it also takes the dative case. We use nach when referring to a point in time that comes after a specific reference point. For example, Wann gehen wir ins Kino? When are we going to the cinema? Wir gehen nach der Arbeit ins Kino. We're going to the cinema after work. Or simply, nach der Arbeit. Here, Arbeit is feminine, die Arbeit. So in the dative case, it becomes nach der Arbeit. Another example. Nach 18 Uhr ist das Restaurant geöffnet. The restaurant is open after 6 p.m. Here, we're saying the restaurant is open after a specific point in time, so we use nach to express after. So, in short, when you want to talk about an event or state that happens after another point in time, nach is your go-to preposition. Let's move on to the next preposition, zwischen. Again, when used as a time preposition, Zwischen takes the dative case. We use zwischen when we want to say between 2 points, times or events. For example, wann fangst du normalerweise an zu arbeiten? What time do you usually start working? Zwischen 8 und 9 Uhr, between 8 and 9 o'clock. Here's an important thing to notice. Even though you're talking about a range of time, between 8 and 9 a.m., this is still about a point in time, not a duration. You're not saying you work between 8 and 9 a.m., which would be a Zeitraum, a period. You're saying you start working at some point between 8 and 9 a.m. Maybe one day at 8, another day at 8:15 or 8:30, and so on. The starting point varies, but it's always a specific point in time. Here's another example. Ich esse zwischen Frühstück und Mittagessen einen Apfel. I eat an apple between breakfast and lunch. You are not eating an apple the entire time between breakfast and lunch. You eat an apple sometime between the breakfast and lunch. And zwischen, just like vor and nach, is used with the dative case when talking about time. With these 3 prepositions, vor, nach, and zwischen, you can now frame any event in relation to another point in time, before, after, or somewhere in between. This gives you a lot of precision when you want to talk about when things happen in German. We can, of course, also combine point-in-time prepositions when we talk about events. The rule here is very simple. When you use a combination of time words, you always move from the bigger unit of time to the smaller one. For example, wann findet das Meeting statt? When is the meeting? Das Meeting findet am Montag 10 Uhr statt. The meeting takes place on Monday at 10 a.m. Here we use am for the day and for the exact time. Another example. Das Meeting findet am 11. Juni 10 Uhr statt. The meeting takes place on June 11th at 10 a.m. Same rule applies. Am for the date, for the time. So the rule is simple. When you have multiple prepositions, you always go from the longer time span, day or date, to the shorter one, to exact clock time. This way, your sentences sound natural and structured, just like a native speaker. All right, let's quickly review what we've learned in this lesson. Today we talked about point-in-time prepositions, or Präpositionen des Zeitpunkts, in German. These prepositions help you say when something happens. We started with for exact clock times, like 9 Uhr. Then we looked at am for days of the week, times of the day, specific dates, and the weekend, like am Montag, am Morgen, or am 5. Mai. We learned that the night is an exception, and we say in der Nacht. We also covered im for months, seasons, years, and moments in the future, like im Juli, im Winter, or in einer Stunde. And we talked about vor, nach, and zwischen, which are used to describe when an event happens in relation to another point in time. Finally, we saw how you can combine these prepositions, starting from the longer time span and moving to the more specific point, like am Montag 10 Uhr. With these prepositions, you can now clearly and precisely talk about when things happen, an essential skill for everyday conversations in German. Now it's your turn. Can you form a sentence using one of these prepositions? Write your own sentence in the comments. I'm excited to see what you come up with. That's it for this lesson. In the next video, we'll move on to another important topic in German. Stay tuned, and bis bald.